Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so glad to see you all here this morning. Despite the fact that you must have sleepless night last night to watch Kim Yena's performance in Sochi. In any case, I'm so glad to see you all. Undoubtedly, we all have very keen interest in Japan, what's happening there. In fact, a lot has been happening under the leadership of Prime Minister Abe, not only on the economic front, but politics and diplomacy and military affairs and foreign relations and in every aspects of Japanese society. A lot has been happening. In that regard, we are very fortunate to have our guest speaker who can tell us everything about what's happening in Japan today. The guest speaker, as you know, he was here a number of times before, so I don't think I need that long introduction for him. But Professor Gerald Curtis is currently the Burgess Professor of Political Science at the Columbia University, and also he concurrently visiting professor at Waseda University and the Senior Research Fellow at the International Institute for Economic Studies in Tokyo. He is the leading U.S. authority in studying Japanese politics and in Japan studies. He spent many years leading various Japanese studies, and he wrote many books, mostly on Japanese politics. The Logic of Japanese Politics, Japanese Way of Politics, Election Campaigning, Japanese Style, and these books, of course, written in English and in Japan and translated in Japan. As a matter of fact, some of these books are translated into Korean as well. And for all his academic contributions and to Japanese society, he is very highly decorated by the Japanese government with various awards and medals of honor and so forth. Particularly, he was awarded in 2004 awarded with the Order of the Rising Sun, Gold and Silver Star, by the Emperor of Japan. And so he is the best speaker to tell us what's happening there, and I'm sure he will share his objective, enlightening views with us this morning. Okay, with no further ado, I would like to invite him to speak. Please join me in
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back here. I think it's just about a year since I was here the last time. Last time I was with my buddy, my colleague, Hugh Patrick. But we're doing solo performances this year. I'm here now, and I think Hugh is coming in May. So I hope you'll have a chance to talk with him. So what I'd like to do this morning in the limited time we have is share with you my impressions of the Abe government a little more than 1 year after its formation, kind of an interim assessment of Abe, his domestic policies, his foreign policies. And I'll make some comments about Korea-Japan relations, although I must say at the outset, my purpose to come to Korea this week, I'm here for a week. I came straight from New York, and from here I'll go to Tokyo and spend a couple of months based in Tokyo. But my purpose to come here was actually not to speak, but to listen. I want to find out, I want to try to have a better understanding of Korean perspectives on international affairs, but especially on Japan, because the relationship is in a very worrisome state. And the question is how to get out of this box. It makes no sense for Korea and Japan not to get along. It's in no one's interest for that to happen. But I'll come back to that in a little while. So, I think when you look at the Abe administration, came into office in December of 2012, so it's a little bit more than a year. I think there's a mixture of enthusiasm and concern. Enthusiasm and concern. The enthusiasm first is over his economic policy. When he became a prime minister, a couple of months later, he went to Washington, D.C., gave a speech in which he said, "Japan is back." And I remember listening to him and thinking, well, that's kind of premature. Maybe Abe is back, because he had been prime minister before. Abe is back, but where's the evidence that Japan is back? There was no evidence. And I think it was greeted with hope, but also considerable skepticism. He was the fifth Japanese prime minister to come knocking on President Obama's door. Aso, Hatoyama, Kan, Noda, now Abe. So how long is this fellow really going to be around? I think that was the question in people's minds. And would he really do anything to get the Japanese economy out of the doldrums? So when you think about that, you have to give Abe a lot of credit. He has accomplished a lot in a year and a half. The mood has changed. The public mood and the business mood in Japan is very positive, very upbeat, optimistic, or at least very hopeful. One of the curious things about public attitudes about Abenomics is that if you ask in a poll, has your economic situation improved over the past year? More than 70% of Japanese say no. They don't feel the positive impact of Abenomics. But, as you know, close to 70% of Japanese support Mr. Abe because they hope, they pray that it'll work. But the point is, public confidence, public enthusiasm is up, and it's because, for the first time in a long time, the Prime Minister seems to actually have a strategy, an economic strategy, which goes by this term Abenomics, 3 arrows. Easy to understand, terrific branding, right? So an aggressive monetary policy, aiming at getting out of deflation and having a 2% inflation target to be accomplished in about 2 years or so. And I think, though there was some skepticism at the beginning, I don't think anyone today doubts that Governor Kuroda is absolutely determined to use every tool in his tool chest in the way of quantitative and qualitative easing to move towards this goal. So far, the real driving force behind Abenomics has been the monetary policy. And that's the shining new arrow in the government's quiver. That is new. That is different. The other two aspects of Abenomics are not really new. Spending a lot of money that the government doesn't have is not new. That's the Keynesian kind of fiscal stimulus policies to try to get some demand, government-driven demand into the economy while you wait for the third arrow to hit the target. The third arrow being structural reforms that will lead to more self-sustained growth. So there's enthusiasm. Let me just make the point. There's enthusiasm about Mr. Abe actually having a strategy to bring about positive change in the Japanese economy, get out of deflation and have a new period of growth. And depends on who you talk to, but at least in the U.S., I think there is enthusiasm about some aspects of Abe's foreign policy, that he wants to strengthen the alliance and make a bigger Japanese contribution to the alliance. He has been the most active traveler, I would think, among all post-war Japanese prime ministers. You know, he's been to every ASEAN country, several of them more than once. This man who had to leave office 6 years ago or 7 years ago, mainly because of health problems, has shown just extraordinary energy and stamina. He's going around the world all the time, and he's visited many countries, and he's trying to make the point that Japan is back on the international stage. And there's been changes in Japanese security policy and defense policy that, as far as the policy itself is concerned, have been modest and basically, I think, desirable. So the defense budget, which had gone down year after year for 11 years, it went up in the last year's budget, but it went up by 0.8%. This is not a country that's embarking on a new era of major military expansion. And in this year's budget, it went up more. It went up 2.8%, and that's about the level it's going to go up year by year over the midterm defense program. That's a 5-year defense program that started this year. So, that's a significant amount of money. Japan is a big economy, so when you increase even at 2 or 3% your defense budget, you're getting a lot more a lot more money. And don't forget, Japan is not a slouch when it comes to defense spending. It ranks number 5 in the world in defense expenditures. But I think if you look at the policy, not at what you worry about where he wants the policy to go in the future, but if you take a snapshot of Japanese foreign policy today, I think it's pragmatic, it's cautious, and from American point of view, overall, it's desirable. One other aspect of positive change is in governance. This doesn't get much attention, but for those of us who are political scientists and look at Japanese politics, this government is run very differently from any previous Japanese government. In Japan, it's common practice to change cabinet ministers every 6, 7, 8 months so that everybody of similar seniority gets his shot at being in the cabinet. Well, Abe appointed his cabinet in December of 2012. He hasn't changed it at all. It's the same cabinet ministers today. That's a very important decision to have continuity. Finally, the people who are in the cabinet know something about the ministries that they're in charge of, and it gives them more power over the bureaucracy than if someone comes in and he can't find his way to the bathroom before he's sent out so that somebody else could come in. It's a big change. The other big change, in Japan, there's a tradition of collective cabinet responsibility. So the prime minister, in general, acts as kind of the chairman of the board, representing the consensus of the cabinet ministers and of the bureaucrats that advise them. This is not that kind of government. This is more of a British Westminster-style, prime minister-led government. There is more power concentrated in the prime minister's headquarters, the Kante, than I think was ever true before. Much more so than in the case of even Koizumi. So that gives a coherence to policymaking that is, I think, new for Japan, and on the whole, desirable, depending on what you think, whether you think this coherent policy is a good policy or not a good policy is in a sense a separate question. And I think the fact that he created a National Security Council in the Prime Minister's office, that the time to do that had come. And so the coordination of policy, both the domestic and foreign policy, by the Prime Minister's headquarters, is a new and important feature of Abe's. But let me get to the concerns, because there are lots of concerns about this government. They're both domestically and internationally. One concern: will Abenomics really succeed? This other concern: what is this Prime Minister's long-term foreign policy goals? Those are the two things that I think get a lot of people pretty anxious and concerned. This is a crunch year in terms of the economy. I think this is really the crunch year for Mr. Abe. In April, the consumption tax will go up by 3 percentage points, which will dampen consumer demand. In April, you know, in Japan, I'm not sure how it works in Korea, but in Japan, wage increases are essentially decided in the spring, on so-called spring struggle, when the companies and labor unions negotiate basic wage increase. And so Abe has put a lot of pressure on Japanese business to raise wages. But will they really raise wages significantly? Bonuses, yeah, there's been increases in bonuses because you can take away what you give. In other words, you can give a bonus now, but not give it the next time if the economy isn't performing well. But you know, the basic wage in Japan is like a floor. You can keep on raising it, but you can't lower it. So a lot of companies are very reluctant to raise wages and then be stuck with a bigger labor cost bill than if the economy doesn't perform as well as expected. And then there's the problem of inflation so far being a kind of cost push inflation coming from the increase in import prices for food and energy in particular. So if you do not get wage increases, and you have a consumption tax increase, and you have continued inflation on the import side, it won't be very long before the Japanese voters say, wait a minute, this Abenomics isn't as good a deal as we expected. So this is a big crunch year for Abe. They have a big fiscal supplemental budget, fiscal stimulus to try to compensate for the impact of the consumption tax. Wages may go up. He may be okay, but you got to keep your eye on this. This is as I said, this is a critical year for Mr. Abe. Last year he did very well because of a bold monetary policy and a lot of very bold rhetoric. But words will carry you far, but only so far. Now it's, I think, the time where we'll see whether the action follows on the rhetoric. I don't spend a lot of time on these economic issues, but I would make three cautionary comments about Abenomics. One is that I think Mr. Abe has oversold the so-called third arrow, and he's going to pay a heavy price for having done so. Abe is not Margaret Thatcher. He's not Ronald Reagan. He's not Koizumi Junichiro. He's not a free market, laissez-faire, a supporter of free market, laissez-faire capitalism who wants to turn Japan into something that looks more like the United States. When Koizumi was prime minister, he always talked about small government, chisana seifu. You do a content analysis, Japanese newspapers. Try to find a time when Mr. Abe used the expression small government. I don't believe he ever does. It's not what he believes. Abe comes out of a tradition of industrial policy reform. He's a reformer, but much more a reformer in the tradition of meaty industrial policy. And that's why it's not by coincidence that his key advisors and staff all come from Medi, you know, Medi's successor. Now, so one, he sells, you know, he oversells the third arrow in the idea that he's a big supporter of deregulation and fundamental reform. As I say, he's a reformer, but not in the way that a lot of observers believe he is. Secondly, I think he's oversold the idea that you shoot this arrow and it's going to have a major, relatively quick impact on the economy. The third arrow is going to fly a long time before it hits its target and has positive consequences. So I think he's created some excessive expectations. And finally, I think what is happening I think the problem with overselling the third arrow is that it contributes to this kind of American hubris, I guess is the way to put it, or Western hubris, that reform means Japan becomes like us. That reform means large-scale immigration, dramatic labor market reform so that you can fire and hire at will, and so on. So I think he's generated unrealistic expectations, and which is now leading to some excessive disappointment. This idea that Japan is going to become like us, it didn't start after Mr. Abe came to office. This has been true of Western views of Japan ever since the Meiji period. The idea that modernization would mean Westernization and Americanization. But we know Japan has modernized, but borrowing ideas, borrowing processes, borrowing policies from other countries, but making of it a distinctive Japanese mix. Now, I don't think that fundamental approach is changing. Part of the so there's this disappointment, and you can see it in the Nikkei. The Nikkei went gangbusters in 2013, but since the beginning of this year, I think it's down by about, I'm not sure of the number, but I think it's close around 10% that the Nikkei has declined since January, as a lot of foreigners are reducing their exposure because they don't see the reforms coming. There are two problems here. One, there are a lot of reforms going on in the Japanese economy that are not driven by the government, but are driven by Japanese business. The so-called lost 2 decades have been a time of very significant change and reform in Japan. 20 years ago, American economists writing about Japan, what was a hot topic? Keiretsu. Can you find anybody writing about Keiretsu today? No, not after you have Mitsui and Sumitomo making joint ventures, Bank of Tokyo and Mitsubishi joining together. All these kinds of cross-Keiretsu alliances, because to survive in this global economy, you have to make change. And I think that we should not underestimate how much change is coming about at the initiative of the private sector, not in response to government mandates. So people underestimate the degree to which Japan is changing, because they look at what the government is doing, and they don't look enough at what the private sector is doing. But the other aspect of this is that I think as part of overselling the third arrow, Abe is overselling or making unrealistic commitments about things. For example, he uses, there's too much branding going on, too many cute slogans, I think, in this government. Another one is womenomics. So Abe says by 2020, which is not very far away, 6 years from now, 30% of members of the board of directors of Japanese companies shall be women. That doesn't make any sense. First of all, right now the percentage is less than 2%. Less than 2% of members of the board of directors are women. How do you go from 2% to 30% in 6 years? Well, there is a way. Put a lot of unqualified women on boards so that you can have the appearance of having a lot of women in executive positions. There'll be some of that, but that's not a way to improve the economy or to improve the situation for women. So the idea that 30% or something like that of executive positions will go to women is both unrealistic and it's really unwise. What are you going to do? Get rid of 30% of men who have had of executives who have come up and have experience and are seasoned professionals and replace them with people who don't know what they're doing? It doesn't make any sense. And it won't happen. But he won't be around to pay the price in 2020, no matter how long he's in office. Another one, strategic economic zones. This is supposed to, sort of be zones of deregulation so that foreigners will come rushing into Japan and invest and be a new stimulus to the economy. So I think there's 6 or 7 special economic zones that are supposed to be established by law, probably in the next diet. We've seen it before. These so-called toku. Koizumi did it. It goes back even before. They weren't successful. They didn't really make much of a difference. This may be a little different, but I'm very doubtful. I think it's more a gimmick. So I think this third arrow is going to come back to kind of wound Prime Minister Abe because of the excessive expectations that he himself has generated. Second cautionary note, Japanese energy situation. There is a huge cost of imports of energy ever since Fukushima. There once were, before the nuclear accident at Fukushima. There were 54 nuclear power plants producing nearly 30% of Japanese electricity supply. How many power plants are in operation today? 0. There's not one that's in operation. So Japan has to import all of its energy. It has very little in the way of recyclables, renewables, and so on. And Abe is committed to restarting these nuclear power plants. It's going to be extremely difficult for him to do so. He may get a few plants back in operation over the next 12 months, but not very many. And a key reason is that women with children are much more concerned about the long-term health of their children than the short-term or long-term health of the economy. And it's interesting, in every country where you do public opinion polls about nuclear power, the strongest opposition to nuclear power comes from well-educated women. Well-educated women who think about, if you have a 5-year-old child today, will that child have thyroid cancer when he's 40? That's what people worry about. So I think the resistance to reviving reliance on nuclear energy is going to be impossible for Abe to overcome. He'll make some progress. He lucked out with the Tokyo governor's election when Mr. Hosokawa, former Prime Minister Hosokawa, ran with the backing of Prime Minister Koizumi and tried to make the zero option, that is, no more reliance on nuclear energy starting now. Make that the issue, and he was defeated, came in third, not because the public likes nuclear energy, but because they thought the governor has other things to worry about. 2020 Olympics, welfare policy, disaster prevention policy. There are lots of other issues besides nuclear energy, and someone who hadn't been around for 20 years, been prime minister 20 years ago, and then disappeared to make pottery, and suddenly shows up and wants to become governor, it didn't sell. So, living with this problem, a very high import bill for energy, high and ever higher prices for electricity. This is going to be a major problem for Japanese economy. Third, and probably the most important thing, whatever Abe does, he cannot change Japan's demographic realities. People are getting old. Women are having fewer and fewer children, a low birth rate, and the population is shrinking. What can he do to deal with these three key issues: aging, low birth rate, and a shrinking population? The answer is not very much. Japan's not going to have large-scale immigration. They will bring more and more women into mainline careers, but it takes a lot of time. So what does this mean for the economy? I think what it means is that companies, to survive, will continue to globalize and to localize their production offshore in the markets where they're selling their goods. I talked to a lot of Japanese businessmen. I've yet in the past year to meet one who said, because of Abenomics, we've changed our strategy. We're now going to build plants in Japan rather than Vietnam or somewhere else, or in the U.S., where a lot of Japanese are building more and more plants to serve the American market. So I think this reality that Japan has to globalize and localize, and that these demographic challenges cannot really be overcome, what does it mean? I think it means Japan has to put much more emphasis on increasing its competitive strength in services and in leading-edge technologies. And maybe most important, bring about major higher education reform. And one of my criticisms of the Abe government is that he puts much too little emphasis on higher education reform. Unfortunately, this government talks about education reform a lot about revising reforms to revise the way children are taught about the past rather than about how they're trained for the future. Now, so So I don't. So my message here is, Abe's done a good job in changing the public mood, changing the foreign investors' mood. There's a lot, as you know, there's been a lot of enthusiasm about Abenomics. It's become kind of a global new term used all around the world, and he may continue to be successful. But let's be realistic. The problems Japan faces are very deep, and as I said, these three strike me as particularly important: overselling the third arrow, energy, and the demographic issues that it faces. The other area of concern, needless to say, is about foreign policy. More specifically, about what is Prime Minister Abe's vision of Japan's role in the region, in East Asia, and in the world. Now, this is where I want to spend, well, I don't have that much time, but where I'd like to spend the rest of my time. First, to try to get our arms around this issue. It's very important to distinguish what is changing in Japanese foreign policy because Abe is prime minister, and what is changing because the world has changed and it doesn't make any difference who the prime minister might be, Japan is changing. That's a very important distinction to make. There's too much emphasis on how Abe is changing Japanese foreign policy. Think about this. How different would Japanese security policy, military policy, defense policy, and foreign policy generally, be if Mr. Noda and the DPJ had been able to survive and be in power today, and Abe never became prime minister? And my answer is not very different at all. Noda was no leftist when it came to Japanese security policy. His defense minister, Mr. Morimoto, was a key defense advisor to the LDP before the DPJ came to power. Noda was in favor of reinterpreting the Constitution to have collective defense. On issues like Senkaku and Dokdo, there's no difference between the position taken by Prime Minister Noda and the position taken by Mr. Abe. So I cannot emphasize enough to you that the key changes ongoing in Japanese foreign policy today are not the consequence of Mr. Abe's coming to office. I'll get in a minute what the consequences are of his coming to office. But the fundamental change in Japanese foreign policy that we see going on is not because Mr. Abe is prime minister. It's a response to what is a dramatically changed security environment. The end of bipolarity, the dramatic rise of China's power and influence, North Korea's acquisition of nuclear weapons, fiscal constraints in the United States. You put all of that together, and you have a different Japanese foreign policy orientation than you had for most of the past 70 years. So during the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were engaged in a contest for supremacy in East Asia and globally. And then for a decade, just about a decade after the Cold War ended, the U.S. enjoyed the position as East Asia's sole superpower. And, there's a lot of argument about is the U.S. in decline or is it not? It's not a really interesting argument because the reality is the U.S. remains the most powerful country in East Asia and will continue to be the most powerful country in East Asia for many years to come. But China no longer accepts American preeminence as it did during the years when its major security concern was the Soviet Union. So China will continue to challenge American political and military supremacy in East Asia. And here's the big difference between this China challenge to American supremacy and the Soviet challenge. The Soviets were not a player in the economic realm as far as power goes. China is, whether it be Korea, Japan, ASEAN, anywhere else in East Asia. The major trading partner is no longer the U.S. The number one trading partner is China. So China is becoming a superpower in every dimension: military, political, and economic, and even cultural. So the Soviet Union posed a strategic challenge. China is posing a much more broad-based challenge to America. So the U.S. pivot, this rebalancing to Asia, I think it's important. I'm glad Obama did it. But it cannot, I believe it cannot restore American supremacy as we knew it before China's rise. This is the undeniable new reality. China is changing the dynamics of politics in East Asia. So, you know, in Japan, a lot of people, especially in conservative circles, think that the problem with American foreign policy here in Asia and elsewhere is that President Obama is weak, indecisive, and that he's not sufficiently supportive of Japan in relations with China. And that only if the Republicans could come back to power, things would be fine. This is an illusion. This is wishful thinking. It's wishful thinking to think that America's strategic concerns would be different whether a Republican rather than a Democrat in the White House. So my point is this. The world has changed, East Asia has changed, and so has the United States. The support for the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty is as strong under Obama as it was under George Bush or anybody else in the post-war period. But there are new dynamics at work here in this region. And it leads to this issue, which is the big problem in U.S.-Japan relations. If Japan takes actions that exacerbate tensions with China, the U.S. will be apprehensive, no matter who the president is. So if the U.S. and Japan are not on the same page in terms of relations with China, there's going to be difficulty in the U.S.-Japan relationship. Through all the history of the U.S.-Japan alliance till recently, Japanese worried that the U.S. might entangle Japan in a conflict that they didn't want any part of, right? So, you know, in this alliance theory, there's this dynamic between entanglement and abandonment. So an alliance is going to get you into trouble that you don't want to be in, or is your ally not going to come to your defense? So there's always this tension, this concern about abandonment and entanglement. So in the post-war period, Japanese worried about entanglement. But there's something new going on. Now it's the United States that's apprehensive about getting entangled in controversies that Japan has with its neighbors. So we face, I think, in the U.S., a new challenge. How do you provide credible assurances to Japan that our security treaty commitments are rock solid without giving Japan a kind of green light to go and make trouble for us by its policies towards China or other countries? And I think it leads to this conclusion. Managing this alliance, the U.S.-Japan alliance, in this much more complex political environment in East Asia than we've seen since the end of the Second World War, requires much, much greater consultation, coordination than ever before between the U.S. and Japan. But not only between the U.S. and Japan, between the U.S., Korea, and Japan. And the fact that the Korea-Japan relationship is so frozen is really very bad news for every country involved. The only one country it's good news for is China, who I imagine is quite happy to see the problems that are that the Americans expressed disappointment with Abe for going to Yasukuni, Korean president goes to Davos and Abe sits in the room to listen to a speech and she doesn't bother to say hello. This is not good news. So let me skip over a little bit. Now, so what is the problem? So as I said, I think the fundamental changes we see ongoing in Japanese security policy are not because Abe is prime minister. They would happen anyway, essentially. The fundamental policies would happen anyway. The problem is that what Abe says about history, the vagueness of his comments about the future role for Japan in the world, have angered people here in Korea and in other countries that were victims of Japanese aggression, and raised many questions in people's minds, not only here in China, but elsewhere as well, including the U.S., about his long-term goals. And, Prime Minister Abe uses a lot of expressions that raise more questions than provide answers. In politics, especially in politics and in foreign policy, words matter a lot. So what does it mean when the Japanese Prime Minister uses the expression in Japanese, Sengo regime no dakyaku, freeing Japan from the post-war regime? What does it mean when the Prime Minister of a country calls for regime change in his own country? What is the meaning of this? Not at all clear. Abe talks about Japan needing to change to remain a first-tier nation. This meaningless term, which as far as I know was coined by Rich Armitage in the Armitage-Nye report, is a way to kind of tickle the Japanese ego. If you want to be first-tier, you got to do more in security and so on. Abe has embraced this term, first-tier. But what does it mean? What's the criteria for being a first-tier nation? Can a country be a middle power and still be first tier? Can Korea be a first tier nation? Is your fate to be a second tier or third tier nation? What is the point of using this kind of language? It's very misleading. It's too vague and open interpretation. But the one that I get most irritated with is sekkyukuteki heiwa shugi in Japanese. In English it's translated as proactive pacifism. This is what we call an oxymoron. It doesn't make any sense. What is proactive pacifism? It's partly a matter of language. And my advice to the Japanese government, which I've been trying to get across, and that's not with success yet, but I have some hope. Stop translating heiwa shugi as pacifism. Pacifism is the rejection of the use of force to protect the national interest. Japan, in that sense, has never been pacifist, not since the end of the Second World War. A country that believes in pacifism doesn't have a security alliance with a country that promises to use nuclear weapons to defend it if necessary. Japan is not pacifist. Abe, I think, wants to solve disputes peacefully, if possible. But Abe Shinzo, he's no pacifist. So what heiwa shugi means is peaceful diplomacy. Active, peaceful diplomacy. Well, that's fine, but then it doesn't really mean very much, does it? Because every country wishes to actively pursue peaceful diplomacy and use force only if necessary. So my concern is that these expressions, proactive pacifism, freeing Japan from the post-war regime, first-tier nation, and other things that he says, raise suspicions that he's trying to obfuscate his real intentions, that he has something in mind here that he's not really expressing. And if that is not true, he should be much more careful about the language he uses. Now, Yasukuni. So, for many years, Yasukuni was a deeply divisive issue in domestic Japanese politics. For many Japanese, for women who lost their husbands and sons in the war, Yasukuni is hallowed ground where you go and you mourn for loved ones who died fighting for their country. But for a lot of other people, not for a lot, for other people, it represents something different and much more than that. Mr. Abe says that Yasukuni is like Arlington Cemetery. Of course, it's not a cemetery, and it's spirits, not bodies that are at Yasukuni. But it's like Arlington Cemetery, where you pay respects to the war dead. But it's not like Arlington Cemetery. It's not like the Vietnam Memorial. If you go to the Vietnam Memorial, you can find the name of a loved one, and you can mourn for that person without taking a position on the Vietnam War or being forced to take a position on the Vietnam War. But you cannot go to Yasukuni and go to the museum and look at the statue of Justice Paul, who was the only judge at the Tokyo War Crimes Trial to vote, the Indian justice who voted to acquit all the defendants of war crimes. You cannot go to Yasukuni and not be implicated in Yasukuni's political view that Japan fought and unfortunately lost a glorious war to free Asia from Western colonialism. That's the argument, right? So Yasukuni propagates a political message. You cannot get around this issue. Even if you move the 14 war criminals out of Yasukuni to a different shrine, you cannot undo the reality that Yasukuni propagates a political message that's offensive to people and countries that were victims of Japanese aggression. And that is offensive to a lot of Japanese, but to fewer Japanese than ever before. Why? Because, before I get there, just to finish my thought. So the point is that Yasukuni is a shrine, a religious shrine, that takes a very strong and clear political position. And it's a position that it confirmed in 1978 when it enshrined those who had been convicted of Class A war crimes at the Tokyo War Crimes Trial, right? And Emperor Hirohito, we know from the memoranda of the diary left by the head of the Imperial Household Ministry, was furious at the enshrinement of the war criminals, especially two of them. I'm going into the details here, and wouldn't visit Yasukuni again. And his son, the current emperor, has never visited Yasukuni Shrine, when before 1978, emperors, as a matter of course, visited Yasukuni. But this is the point, and this is the problem of Yasukuni, the danger of Yasukuni. Now, so many years after this war, after the war is over, the question of whether the prime minister and other government officials should visit Yasukuni, should pay homage at Yasukuni, is no longer the controversial issue in domestic politics that it was before. 70 years of democracy. 70 years in which Japanese children were not taught the realities about Japanese Japanese policy in the first half of the 20th century. 70 years in which Japan has been a really good neighbor to Korea and to China and to other countries, providing lots of economic assistance and the rest. 70 years after the end of the war, a lot of Japanese, especially young Japanese, say, what is it anybody else's business how our prime minister pays respects to people who died fighting for their country? So Yasukuni is being transformed into an issue of nationalism, not because Japanese are becoming more militaristic, which I don't believe is true, but because there's been a loss of memory in Japan about the war. And there's been an intensification of memory in Korea and China about the war. This is a huge gap. There's a loss of memory because Japanese don't educate their young people about the war. And there's an intensification, I think, in Korea and in China because these countries have a lot more self-confidence. They're not dependent, as they were at one point, either on Japanese aid or in the Cold War on this relationship. So there's a lot of suppressed emotions, I think, are being expressed. And in Japan, the reaction is, why are you beating up on us? We're a democracy. We've been supportive of Korea. Why are you beating up on us now? What is this all about? So this is a very dangerous issue. And I think the bottom line for me is that the prime minister, it's natural for a leader of a country to pay respects to those, as Koizumi told me many times when he was prime minister, that he thought that, in his view, the war was a mistake. It was a bad war. But young boys who were drafted and sent off to fight for their country and died doing their patriotic duty, they deserve, I'm going to pay my respects to them. I understand that. But, Abe is somewhat different from Koizumi in his view of the war in the past, it seems. But more importantly, this issue is simply too hot a potato. And I think there has to be a way either to go to Chidorigafuchi Cemetery or find an alternate site, as a lot of Japanese, even in the LDP, people have argued. So the only hope is that now that he's made his pilgrimage to Yasukuni, he said that his great regret from his first time in office was that he didn't go to Yasukuni. Well, now he's fulfilled his commitment. If there can be some improvement in Korea-Japan relations, and if there can be some improvement in China-Japan relations over the coming 12 months, that puts enormous pressure on Abe not to go back to Yasukuni and undo the progress that's been done. But if there's no progress made in these relationships, Japan's relations with its neighbors, he will go back to Yasukuni. He doesn't have anything to lose. And by going to Yasukuni the last time, it's not that a lot of people like that idea, but they like the fact that he poked his finger in the Chinese eye. China was beating up on Japan. Korea was beating up on Japan for the entire time he was prime minister, for 12 months, and so created this nationalist reaction. Both sides have to figure out how to get around this issue. You don't want to stimulate right-wing nationalism in Japan, but I must say, I think the policies being pursued by President Park and by Xi Jinping, they're doing exactly that. Now, okay, so what's the issue for Prime Minister Abe? I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs magazine, I guess last year, a couple months after he became prime minister, with the title "Japan's Cautious Hawks," and it was not only about Abe, but he's a hawk, but he's pragmatic, he's cautious. When he thinks with his head, he's ideological and emotional when he listens to his heart. And so the question is how to allay these suspicions that his ideological leanings create. And I think it's really the point I've been trying to make all this morning. He needs to do far more than he's done to dissociate his views of Japan's past from his vision of Japan's future. The problem is that his views of Japan's past, a lot of people think, are what inform his vision for Japan's future. I don't believe that's true, frankly. He has a view of the past. It's a lot has to do with honoring the memory of his grandfather, Prime Minister Kishi, and so forth and so on. But he does not do enough to dissociate these views of the past from his vision for the future. So, sending emissaries to the U.S. to explain Yasukuni, that is not going to help. It only makes things worse. Protesting the erection of statues to honor, to commemorate the suffering of comfort women. They've gone up in New Jersey and other parts in the United States, and then the Japanese government protests. That only backfires against Japan. It would make I'm under no illusion that this is going to happen, but it would make much more sense for the Japanese government to send a representative, along with the Koreans and the Korean American community, to pay respects to the victims of this sexual violence at these statues. That would put Japan on a high moral plane. I must take a minute to on this point about comfort women. Abe gave a speech at the UN General Assembly last September, mostly about women. And in that speech, he said this, quote, "It's a matter of outrage that there continues to be sexual violence against women during times of armed conflict, even now in the 21st century. Japan will do everything possible to prevent such crimes against women and to support both materially and psychologically those people who unfortunately became victims of such acts." Now, I listened to that and I said, wow, if he really means it, he will start by giving psychological and material support to victims of such acts of sexual violence committed by the Japanese military during the Second World War. But he's not saying that. So I think, and this gets to the Korea-Japan issue, and then I'll stop. But what's missing from Mr. Abe's rhetoric or language about the past is that he hasn't said as clearly as he should say, there is no place in today's Japan for the values and the aspirations that led Japan down a path of imperialism and colonialism and aggression. He needs to say that. There is no place in Japan today for those values that led Japan to do what it did in the first half of this century. And that is the view of most Japanese. There is no place for that in Japan today. But he hasn't said it. And On the Murayama statement, what he has said is not enough. Yeah, it's better than it was a year ago, because when he was campaigning to be prime minister, he was implying he wanted to change or amend, update that statement. Now he says he accepts it. But those of you who understand Japanese will understand the nuance of the language. In Japanese, what cabinet ministers Abe and Kishida and other cabinet ministers say about Murayama's statement is the following. Murayama-dan wa Abe seiken mo toushu shiteiru. You know this word, toshu suru? It means you don't reject it, you accept it, but you don't necessarily agree with it. He has not said, in his own words, he has not repeated the Murayama statement in his own words. That's what he needs to do. That would make a huge difference, I think, in attitudes towards him in Korea and elsewhere. So you know, Japan's rich, it's powerful, it's democratic. It can afford to be magnanimous in dealing with issues that remain from its dark past, like further action of compassion for so-called comfort women. Now, I'll conclude with this. Korea-Japan relations. As I said, I came this week to listen rather than to speak, but as you can see, I'm doing all the speaking and you're doing all the listening. So I have to say, I want to say something about this relationship as I see it. 3 points. One, both Korea and Japan are U.S. allies. And the U.S. therefore has an abiding interest in seeing that bilateral relations between Korea and Japan are cooperative, and that both support the strengthening of trilateral security cooperation. Don't forget, a key purpose of the U.S.-Japan alliance is to make it possible for the U.S. to defend South Korea. And it's not in anyone's interest to permit historical animosities from undermining these alliance relationships between the U.S. and Japan, the U.S. and South Korea. Second, it's difficult. I'm getting a better understanding, but it's still difficult for me, and I think for many people, to understand why the new chapter in Korea-Japan relations that seemed to be opened with the Obuchi Kim Dae-jung joint declaration on a new partnership, on a new relationship. Why was that book slammed shut? And I think so I know a lot of the arguments, Shimane-de and then on the Japanese side, Lee Mung-buk's visit to Dokdo and so on. But the conclusion that a lot of people in the U.S. draw, and in Japan as well, is that this has a lot more to do with domestic Korean politics than with anything that Japan has done. And that it's irresponsible, politically irresponsible, to undermine the national interests by playing up to domestic political concerns to this degree. That is the perception, and it's why there's a lot of irritation and puzzlement over Korean policy towards Japan in Washington. Third, it's very unclear what is Korea's bottom line about normalizing relations with Japan. A bottom line has to be a realistic line. It's not realistic for Korea to demand that Japan take a so-called correct view of history, if that means taking a Korean view of history. It is not going to happen. For better or worse, that's not going to happen. It's not realistic to have a bottom line that demands that Japan recognize Korean sovereignty over Dokdo. I personally wish they would. I think they should have done it a long time ago. It's not going to happen. It's not realistic for Korea and Japan to resort to legalisms in the way they argue their disputes. The Japanese say everything was settled by 1965 normalization treaty. The Koreans say you have to accept legal responsibility for the comfort women issue. If you argue like lawyers, you're not going to get anywhere. But I think that's what has been going on. So the reason I'm here this week, I'm trying to understand what influential Koreans believe a realistic bottom line is. And in my view, I don't think it's that difficult to identify the components. One is that Japan and Korea agree in effect to freeze the Dokdo Takeshima issue. You have control. You have administrative control. Japan's not challenging the administrative control, not like the Chinese about Senkaku. Why use inflamed rhetoric? Why do things to provoke the Japanese to say, no, it's our territory, more loudly? I think the Japanese would be quite quiet about Dokdo if they weren't politically having to respond. Very senior member of the Japanese, of this government, I won't mention which one, but very senior member said to me, if only the Koreans would stop talking so loudly about Dokdo, I could put it aside. But if they're going to make a big issue of it, I have to stand up for our basic position, which is that it's Japanese territory. The most serious issue involves comfort women. And this is a terrible issue for Japan because it's undermining the Japanese image in the U.S. and elsewhere, not only here. And I think the onus is on Japan, on the Japanese government, to do more about resolving this issue. So, as I said, instead of denying government involvement in the recruitment of these women, which is really not the issue, the Japanese government should stress how much it abhors the policies that led to this kind of sexual violence among young girls, and offer to do what it can to enable the remaining women to live their last years in dignity. But, Japanese worry that any concessions they make will only lead to further demands, that Korea will simply move the goalposts back. So clearly there has to be a conversation, a dialogue, to try to overcome this mutual distrust so that if Japan makes a public concession, they have the confidence that the Korean government will accept it and respond positively, not make a further demands. So, well, that's all I want to say. I have lots of words about China, but my final conclusion is this, because I don't want to end on a gloomy gloomy note. I'm optimistic about Japan, and I have some great language to explain it, and I can't find it in my oh, here it is. I'm optimistic about Japan. This situation in Northeast Asia is dangerous, but let's face it, Japan is going to remain one of the most successful economies in the world, whatever happens to Abenomics. I know why Abe wants to say how he saved Japan from pulled Japan out from having such a terrible economic situation. It isn't true. Japanese economy hasn't been half as bad as Abe claims it has been over the past 20 years. It's a shrinking population. So if you measure GDP, gross GDP, doesn't look very impressive, but measure it by per capita. Japan held its own against European countries. Living standards have continued to increase, and unemployment is low, and so on. I think relations with Korea somehow will be managed. These countries have to find a way to normalize their relationship because it's clearly not in anyone's interest not to. Both are democracies. Both are U.S. allies. Unlike Sino-Japanese relations, there's a dense network of personal relationships between Koreans and Japanese in business, in academia, in many other ways. There's a huge popularity of Korea among Japanese young people, Korean soft power, and so on. And finally, Japan is going to continue to be one of the most civilized places on the planet. So I've been involved with Japan 45 years, almost 50 years. I first went to Japan in 1964, Tokyo Olympics. I'm hoping to be around in 2020 so I can write my last book, From the Tokyo Olympics to the Tokyo Olympics. And what impresses me after all these years is the power of Japanese values that underlie its social organization, its economic behavior, its political democracy, and its peaceful foreign policy. Honesty, diligence, cleanliness, politeness, emphasis on high-quality standards, and so on. Sense of community, we saw it in Tohoku. That's what defines Japan. So does an aversion to violence and war. So I don't know what the conclusion is. The conclusion, as I said, there's reasons to be optimistic and to be apprehensive about this government. You want to try to do things that will encourage the optimistic scenario and not the apprehensive scenario. But I must say, relations between Japan and Korea and Japan and China are moving in the opposite direction. something has to be done. Sorry for going on for so long. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much for very wide, detailed coverage of what's happening in Japan. I'm very glad that you said you came to listen. I'm sure there are many Koreans who will tell you a lot of things which are from a little bit different perspective from you. I myself have many comments on what you just said, but since we don't have much time, so I would invite some comments and the questions from the floor. Ambassador and the... Yeah, okay. Ambassador first, and then... Yeah, and Dr. Ahn, and then Mr. Chi.
Dr. Curtis, thank you for...
Please make question as succinct as possible.
Thank you for your interesting and perspective and overview. My quick question is that Japan wants to normalize, wants to be a normal country. However, looking through the prism of history in certain parts of the world, especially East Asia, there is a concern that a normal Japan could be a muscular Japan. Now, from your perspective, do you see a so-called normal Japan, a defensive Japan, or do you also think or believe that East Asia or some countries in this region could have concerns or can feel threatened in the future from a normal Japan? Thank you.
Why don't you invite a few more questions?
Well, thank you, Dr. Curtis. As a neighbor, I was happy to see Japanese economy revive, even though I'm not sure of the ultimate success of the Abenomics. But the two issues that have been thorny between Korea and Japan, you mentioned Dokdo and comfort women. And I think your advice on Dokdo is a wise one. I'm not sure whether this is the right analogy. It's like I'm married to my wife, and my neighbor keeps saying my wife is his wife. Just because he says that doesn't make my wife his wife, right? We control Dokdo. And whatever they say about Dokdo doesn't make Dokdo theirs. So I think we can really control that one. But comfort women, I think, is more emotionally explosive issue. And as you may know, there are only 55 Korean comfort women remaining. And if Abe really wants to make Japan a first-tier country, I think this is the utmost issue that he needs to address, especially given his public speech at the United Nations General Assembly. After all he says, all that he said, to exclude comfort women's situation so blatantly, that really casts doubt on his sincerity and intentions. So do you have any advice on how we can persuade the leaders of Japan that this is something that's morally incumbent upon them as a first-tier nation that they really are trying to be?
Two more the comments, Dr. Ahn and Mr. Che, and then.
Thank you very much, Professor Curtis. Well, as you said, the bilateral relationship between Japan and Korea at the perhaps lowest ebb. And as you said, we are really worrying about, deteriorating the relationship, extended to even the trilateral relationship in U.S., Korea, and Japan. But here, I would like to convey one message. Koreans are really disturbed by the fact that Japan continued to justify and even doctor the historical fact. You remember even the Nanjing massacre, the NHK, the board members indicated that that's been, doctored by the United States, not the Japanese. Okay, they are going as far as to make that kind of statement. So we are really, really worrying about this development. Maybe Japanese now, the young generation might be educated on that sort of the historical, distorted fact. So I would like to suggest you, when you go, Japan to make another presentation, I think this Japan should make the history as the way it stands. Do not erase from the historical fact from the textbook. And now Japanese government enforced to erase all the historical wrongdoings and wartime, atrocities ranging from the sex slave and Nanjing, so on and so on. So, if Japan continue to do that, I think that we are going to lose the mutual trust between Japan and Korea. And from that line, what I would like to suggest is that the U.S. is the only country to make sure that Japan, to recognize the historical fact. Maybe in the long run, Japan might even deny the Pearl Harbor attack. Okay, they might justify why they attacked, Pearl Harbor. The U.S. is ready to accept that fact. The same is true for Koreans. So along that line, I think this, once Japan, they adopt this historical fact, but the Kerry, Secretary Kerry, said here, both Japan and Korea should put our history behind. Well, how we can put the history behind as long as Japan keeps, justifying and doctoring the historical fact. So that is most disturbing fact. Well, I should recognize that Japan and Korea should continue, bilateral economic cooperation and, value, deeply committed to democracy, human values, so on and so on. But history must be, stand the way it is. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Professor Curtis. I fully agree with your view that of American foreign policy in Asia and trilateral relationship with U.S., Japan, and Korea. And I think that is also good for Korea's national interest. However, I would say that national politics, international politics in short term is in a way based on power game or balance of power game. But long-term international politics should be more of in, long-term good faith and friendship. Koreans have good, good trust and friendship sense, and we trust Americans, but we don't trust Japanese. I suggest that the Japanese should learn the lessons what Germans did after World War II. If Germans didn't do that policy, that there is no prosperous and peaceful European countries today. And I don't think we do have that kind of, trust, good faith, and friendship, and respect. If they did have such kind of thing, they could have been good leader in Asia too. Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
So we have very little time.
Yes.
But, very, very briefly. So first about normal country. I don't really understand. I don't know what it means to be a normal country. Does that mean being like the U.S., normal with nuclear weapons and force projection capabilities and so on? I don't think that's normal. So I think the term is it's problematic. But more importantly, you cannot be a normal country if your relations with your most immediate neighbors are abnormal. Much more emphasis has to be placed, I think, by Mr. Abe, by the Japanese government, on how to normalize relations with China and Korea. That is the first step to becoming a normal country. The idea that you can develop good relations with everybody else, but not with China and Korea, is like Americans having good relations with the world, but having enemies in Mexico and Canada. It doesn't make any sense. You have to. So I think the problem is that there's too much emphasis, in my view, there's too much emphasis in this government on becoming a so-called normal country, and not enough emphasis on trying to figure out how to deal with issues like Mr. An was suggesting about history, about how to normalize relations with your immediate neighbors. On the comfort women, and so I think there is reason for people to be concerned I understand why neighboring countries are concerned that a normal Japan is really not normal at all, but a threat. As I said, there's nothing in what is being done policy-wise that would support that argument, but the language that we hear coming out from people in the Abe government about you said something I think about one day they'll say that Pearl Harbor was okay. But there are people around Abe who make that point now, that Japan was encircled by the ABCD countries, America, Britain, China, and the Dutch, and they had no choice, and that it was Roosevelt, the head of NHK, one of those guys, the novelist on the NHK board, saying that this was a conspiracy by Roosevelt, backed by crazy, encouraged by the Comintern to force Japan into war. Nonsense. So these things have. Abe, I think has to be much more forceful in countering these kinds of statements and saying that he doesn't believe them. Anyway, on the comfort women, I don't know. I think both sides are trying to find a way to resolve this issue, and I think one of the big hang-ups is whether the Japanese government admits legal responsibility. I don't know Korean language, but I know Japanese language pretty well. There are ways in Japanese and in Korean, I'm sure, to express a sense of responsibility without making it entirely clear whether that's legal or moral or humanitarian or what. If any languages can pull this off, your languages can, and that should be the goal. You want to resolve this issue. You don't want to have to fight over a word of legal responsibility, because that is not a realistic way to approach it. But I have a sense, and it's just an instinct more than any real knowledge, that there's a groping on both sides to try to find a way to resolve this issue. And I just hope that Prime Minister Abe understands how explosive this issue is, not only in Korea-Japan relations, but in Japan's image in the world and in the United States. And I don't disagree about the distorted history, how to come to grips with the realities of history. I'm very pessimistic. It's been the chance was kind of missed early on in the 1950s. And then in the 1990s, Kono's statement, Murayama's statement, it looked like Japan was becoming more repenting of its history. But it's been lost. It's very difficult to bring this about. Finally, one of the big differences between Japan and Germany, it's not only that the Germans have apologized. Japanese have apologized a lot too. It's not the apology. It's that the environment was so different. In Europe, the response to let's not ever let this happen again was to embrace Germany inside NATO, inside the EU. So the first Secretary General of NATO, he said, what's the purpose of NATO? Keep the Americans in. Keep the Russians out. Keep the Germans down. That was what NATO was about. And it worked. And now Germany is the most important country in the EU. But in Asia, that was not an option. A regional security arrangement was not an option. So the U.S. security alliances provided that. So what was the purpose of the U.S.-Japan alliance? Keep the U.S. in, keep the Russians out, and keep a cork in the bottle of Japanese military development. That was the expression used by the American military, a cork in the bottle of Japanese military development. But now the situation in Asia has changed so much, there has to be another way found. And there has to be an effort to start the process of building a security community in East Asia. That's the normalization that needs to take place. There has to be an embracing of Japan, China, Korea, and other countries of each other, not a refusal to talk to each other. And I think that's where the people have to figure out how to move forward. So, being realistic, I'm pessimistic because I don't think Japan, this government, or any government we're going to see in the foreseeable future is going to come to grips with history in the way that a lot of us would like it to see it do so. But But to some extent, that has to happen, and more importantly, have to figure out how to improve relations among East Asian countries. Well, I have much more to say, but I'll stop here.
Okay. Let me make a few
Please.
points actually related to some of the points you made and the comments made by some of the previously. First of all, I think give you my quick response to your conclusion, and that is that you're optimistic about Japanese future, which is good for not only for Japan, for the rest of the world, particularly for Korea. After all, Japan is still the largest country in the world, and we all for Japan doing well. However, if you are pessimistic about the Japanese current historical stance, I don't think you can be optimistic. Japan, and my second point regards to your Abe's third arrow. You said the Abe oversold third arrow. I would say there's over expectation from abroad. However, if the arrow doesn't work, then I would say Abenomics will fail. Abenomics so far succeed, in my view, in terms of getting Japanese economy out of deflation, already succeeded. But the ultimate goals of Abenomics is just not the getting out of deflation, but the revitalize Japanese economy and enhance its growth potential. How you can do that? Structural adjustments, which Japan was not able to do that. And that's why this time, people say this time may be different than the Abe. They say, so global financial community is watching very closely. In my view, second half of this year, unless he deliver about the third arrow, then I was very disappointed from your observation, which I think is you just told us the facts, and that is that Abe is not very serious about third arrow. I was afraid of that. Actually, I was wondering he is serious enough. If that is the case, then Abenomics will fail, and Japan will not be prosperous, as you said, and optimistic in the future. That's the way I see it, because shrinking workforces, not increasing productivity, where Japan can do better. And so Japan, only way you can increase. That's the way I understood was the Abenomics has two objectives. One, getting out of deflation by achieving 2% the inflation target within 2 years. Another one was to get back to 2% growth trend growth, which is growth potential. Without third arrow working, never achieve 2% growth rate. So I all for good relationship with Japan. So I was really looking forward to have something happening in third arrow. That's my point. Another with the comfort movement, the point I always said that, this is not the economic or legal issue. Japan still denied the fact that there was such a thing. Which is really, and we have the survivors of that, the victims. And so, how can you have, you keep saying that we have to, have to talk with Japan, Abe. I'm all for it. But how can you keep saying that, they don't provide the environment? How can President Park or Xi Jinping say, when Korean public is so mad at him? Because, and you said Yasukuni too, and you said, and unless Korea or Chinese leader changes attitude in talking to him, then he will keep going to Yasukuni. Well, there will be no talk then, in my view, because he keep irritating, and then let's talk, And then another point you said, the difference between Germany and Japan. I'm sure there are many differences. But when you apologize, you and I say, I'm sorry. You don't negotiate. I say, what word? I say sorry, right? But you negotiate. What word do you use? It's no longer, it's not an apology. Japan keeps saying that I was in Japan in 1986 with the president there. And then we know what we had is hard negotiation in choosing word, in expressing Japanese regret. I mean, is it really sorry? Billy Brandt went to the Jewish cemetery and just kneeled down and then said sorry. I mean, that's what it is about. So why can't they say sorry and do something about it? So this is, the kind of the perspective we have, the reality here in Korea. So I think this is the real thing. We are all for it. Particularly, I really would like to see have good relationship with Japan. We cannot move, I mean, if you don't like a neighbor, we can move as individual, but the country cannot move, right? So I think we have to get along with that. But we have to work together. And Dr. Issue, I feel just same way. I just not go around and keep saying, this is my wife, this is my son. So you don't have to say that. And the thing is, Japanese government insists that the high school textbook says Dr. is. I mean, this is really again, it's a vicious circle. And you said I thought this very, very, very ironic because you said that Japan only history only teaches the past, not the future. In fact, they're not teaching the past. They're not teaching what they've done in the past. And so I think they should teach the right history to. So I'm a big friend of Japan, and so I would like to see Japan doing well economically. For that, we would like to provide you, since you are here to listen to us, we'd like to provide you right.
Appreciate it. No, I appreciate that. And I listen to you. I don't think there's a thing I would disagree with what you just said. That is the problem that we face with, or that Japan faces. And it's very unfortunate because I think the great majority of Japanese do not share these right-wing revisionist views that are getting so much publicity these days. What I said about teaching about the past was just to be clear. The Japanese do not teach their children about the past. And what Abe wants to do is now to teach them about the past, but in this whitewash, sanitized manner. That'll be worse than what you have now. But I have Japanese come to Columbia, take my course, and their eyes open wide because they didn't know anything about their own history of the first half of the 20th century. On the third arrow, I'm relatively pessimistic about the third arrow, but it's not going to be there are things going on in the way of reform. The economy will not grow as strong as a lot of the particularly foreign investment community expects. So there's a danger of an excessive reaction out of disappointment, over expectation, and I think Abe is stimulating that over expectation by his language. But so Japan's not going to grow that strongly, would be my guess, and we may find if I come back next year, I won't say that next year we'll talk about the new prime minister who's just come to power in Japan. Probably Abe will still be around, but in politics, everything with this government, with his popularity, hinges on the success of Abenomics. If that's not successful, he's not going to last very long. So there we are. And on comfort women, I couldn't agree with you more. It's just so sad to see the Japanese leadership trying to deny this awful truth about history. And so you have to hope that sensible people will influence Mr. Abe to do the Nixon goes to China take that kind of approach. He is the one person who could make a very bold and forward-looking step and not lose the support of the conservatives in Japan, because he is legitimately one of them. So you have to hope that he has enough sense to do that.
Okay, thank you very much sharing your really the candid and the insightful views with us. You know, we should have Professor Curtis come to Seoul more often, and maybe we should invite him to live in Korea as long as he lived in Japan, so that he would understand. But anyway, he's a good friend of ours.
Then I'll be 120 by the time we're finished.
But anyway, so he's a good friend of Japan and good friend of Korea. So let's give big hand for his presentation and let's have him back.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank you.